The Drinks Adventures podcast is proudly supported by our friends at Bintani, Australia's leading supplier of ingredients for the brewing and distilling industries. Bintani has all the ingredients you need, and they have experts in all categories on the team, so they understand how ingredients work together like no other supplier. Bintani handpicks the best. I'm James Atkinson, and this is Drinks Adventures, the podcast where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and explore trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Thanks for joining me again on the Drinks Adventures podcast, and this week I play a couple of interviews from my visit to Tasmania last year. The Tasmanian drink scene has absolutely exploded in recent decades. In Season 1 I talked Tassie whisky with Sullivans Cove Distillery and cider with Willie Smith Cider. This time I explore the unique brewing operation of Bruny Island Beer and Cheese with head brewer Evan Hunter. I also catch up with Paul Lipscombe of Sailor Seeks Horse, an exciting new wine company located in Tasmania's Huon Valley. Paul and his wife Gilli also make the highly acclaimed Pinot Noirs for Home Hill Winery in the Huon. And this is a chat exploring the evolution of Australian Pinot Noir, which has made leaps and bounds in recent years and is just starting to get the respect it deserves on the world stage. I hope you enjoy these Tasmanian adventures.
I'm Evan Hunter. I started out my brewing career at the other end of Tasmania, working for some years for Seven Sheds Brewery. I've also worked for Lark Distillery, Moo Brew, and I came across Bruny Island because I was at the time searching for a new brewing project, and I was originally driving to establish a brewery of my own, but as you know, they're fairly capital intensive and beyond my means at the time. So as part of that search, I got contacted by Nick Haddo, who was the owner of Bruny Island Cheese. And he had been looking to diversify his business. So it was a matter of the right people meeting at the right time. And we had a bit of a chat and realised that we both wanted to accomplish much the same thing with a brewing project.
It's pretty unique having a brewery and a cheesery on the one site. What sort of opportunities are there for integrating what you're doing?
It is a rare thing, and the opportunities offered for collaboration are surprisingly vast. There's one beer that we make in particular called Whey Stout. So it's stylistically a milk stout or a sweet stout. And traditionally, that style of beer uses lactose to give it more body and more residual sweetness. Rather than using the refined lactose, we use the source of lactose that we have coming out of the cheesery on almost a daily basis, which is the whey left over after cheese making. So after the cheesemakers take out the milk solids and the fats to make their cheese with, you're left with a kind of watery milk with all the lactose dissolved in it. In order to give the beer enough of the lactose to make an impact on the character of it, we have to use a fair bit. So we're sitting here at the moment looking at the cheesery on one side and the brewery about 50 metres away on the other side, and it's a matter of siphoning the whey into buckets, carrying it over to the brewery and weighing the whey and tipping it into the brew kettle.
Are there any challenges working with such a raw product?
I wondered about that before we started, what the microbiological risks of having a brewery in close proximity to a cheesery with all the cultures that they use, and also a sourdough bakery, because we've got a brick oven here and it's pumping out sourdough bread every day. But touch wood, I've never had a problem. I guess as a brewer you have to test your cleaning practices and also have faith in them. I'm pretty stringent about the procedures we follow in there, and so far the only wild organisms that have been in the brewery are ones I've deliberately put in there, so fingers crossed it stays that way.
And aside from the whey, you're also working with other local producers with the ingredients that go into the beers. Yeah,
that's instrumental in what we do. We made it the policy from the beginning that we would only use Tasmanian hops in the brewery. For that reason, we have a fairly close relationship with Hop Products Australia, who operate Australia's oldest hop farm at Bushy Park, just north of Hobart. But we also explore all opportunities we can for sourcing raw ingredients from other producers as well. So most of our grain that we use to make beer with is locally sourced. We're fortunate to have a malting plant in Tasmania, and of course Tasmania is the perfect climate for growing barley. But we're also lucky to have a farm on Bruny Island that grows a variety of cereals, including wheat, barley and oats. So we utilise a fair bit of that in some of the beers that we make. Outside of that, Tasmania is a real cornucopia for various kinds of produce. So we've explored in the past using things like pepperberries and even the leaves of native tea tree in some of our special, a bit more obtuse beers.
It's notoriously difficult working with the raw grains that you would be working with that are supplied locally from Bruny Island. What does that involve for you in the brewing process?
A much longer day. To be able to use those fantastic locally grown grains, it involves an extra step in the mashing process. It's called cereal mashing, and it's basically equivalent to cooking up some porridge out of oats. You start off with the grain at a cooler temperature and slowly increase the temperature in stages, finishing off by boiling for a period of time. And once that process is finished, all the starches inside the grains are broken down and ready to be accessed by the enzymes in the barley and ultimately turned into various kinds of sugars that are then eaten by yeast, which do the wonderful work of making our beer for us.
It's a pretty hands-on process as well with the equipment that you've got here.
Yeah, so we don't have any mechanical stirrers. We rely on operators to stir with a paddle. All of our grain gets milled into 10 kilo buckets, and when we mash, which is mixing the grain with water, one person tips and one person stirs. By the time all of the barley and other grains are in the mash tun, we're dealing with literally a ton of mash. It's good, it's decent exercise, but I've now brewed 3 days in a row and I'm looking forward to not brewing tomorrow.
What challenges are there in running a brewery in such a remote location?
There's the challenges that you might be able to imagine pretty easily, like just getting the raw ingredients down here. You know, basically everything gets shipped to Hobart and then we've got to collect it and bring it here. So raw ingredients, bottles, everything needs to be brought over on the ferry, which joins us to mainland Tasmania. Then going out the other way, nearly all our customers are not on Bruny Island, so everything that we make has to be ferried across. By far the biggest challenge though is staff. Bruny Island has a permanent population of something like 600 people, and there are not many qualified brewers on the island. So most of my workers in the brewery live on mainland Tasmania, and so the way that I structure their work relies on the ferry timetable and restricts the kind of hours that we can work during the day. So unfortunately at the moment I'm the only one that can do that 4 a.m. start because the ferry doesn't start until, well, the earliest they can get here is 7 o'clock. So yeah, managing people is always the biggest challenge.
What's involved with, working out the beer and cheese matches, and is that something you're actually thinking about in the brewery, making beers that are gonna fit with the cheeses that Nick's team are making?
Thinking about which cheese is going to pair with the beer does not factor into how the beer is made, but it's always a fun process after the beer is made and ready to drink. You know, prior to getting the labels printed, we've got to sit down and decide what cheese goes best with that beer. Then that gets printed on the label. So it's usually just a matter of getting whatever cheeses are available from the cheesery at the time, and the head cheesemaker will come and join us, and whoever's in the brewery that day will gather around, drink some beer, eat some cheese. It's interesting, there's usually a consensus on which cheese goes best. Occasionally some differences of opinion, but it's usually pretty clear.
We were talking before about the current range of beers. It's the farm ale that's the biggest seller. Why is it called a farm ale?
It's called a farm ale because all of the ingredients that go into it are from Tasmanian farms. So the wheat that's grown on Murrayfield Farm here on Bruny, the oats that are grown at Kindred Organics in northwest Tasmania, and the base malt, which is grown in Tasmania and malted in Devonport. Of course, all the hops are Tasmanian. We use Galaxy, Ella and Cascade. And the water comes from just down the road from here. There's a spring and we get water delivered to us. It tells a story about Tasmania and all of those places that those wonderful raw ingredients are sourced from. And that's a story that we never get tired of telling. It's wonderful building that bridge between the person drinking the beer and the country that it's from.
Most Australians would think of wine as being the most logical pairing for cheese. Is that something that you've managed to break down at Bruny Island?
I think that is a common perspective in Australia, and I think our sort of more high-end cheese culture takes a lot of its cues from French cheese culture, but it's not always the case in many of the great cheese-making regions of the world, right through England and Germany and all of those great beer brewing regions. They all make cheese, and beer and cheese have been a natural pairing in those parts of the world for as long as those things have been made. A great way to illustrate perhaps why beer and cheese go so well together is that when you think about it, they both ultimately come from grass. The animals that produce the milk that makes the cheese eat grass, and the beer that we make is made from the seeds of that grass.
What do you look for in a good beer and cheese match?
You can have pairings that contrast. Sometimes you can have like a particularly richly flavoured beer. It might be the case that there's a kind of sharp acidic cheese that will help cut through that richness. It can be vice versa as well. Sometimes quite a mouth-coating kind of creamy cheese can be contrasted with a kind of palate-cleansing beer that will help those flavours glow but also kind of refresh your mouth as well. On the other hand, complementary pairings can be really good too. So one of the best, I think, cheese and beer matches that we do is with our whey stout and our Saint cheese. The Saint is a camembert style cheese, so it's very oozy and creamy, and one of our former cheesemakers described it as a cookies and cream pairing.
It's been a big part of Bruny Island Cheese's business model, selling direct to consumers through the mailing list and social media. Are a lot of people choosing to buy the beer and the cheese online?
Yes, it's an important and growing part of the business. As you mentioned, we already had an established cheese club, so the beer naturally from the outset has been sold via that cheese club. We do distribute interstate. We've got a presence in New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Queensland. Of course, I'd always recommend coming straight to the source and getting the freshest beer possible directly from us.
No worries. Well, Evan, thanks heaps for the chat.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great.
So maybe just to start, you could just introduce yourself and Sailor Six Horse.
Sailor Six Horse is owned by my wife Gilli and I. So I'm Paul Lipscombe.
And we probably should paint the picture for our listeners. You're sitting on a tyre and I'm sitting on a log.
Yeah.
Literally
Sorry about that.
at the bottom of the vineyard.
Yeah.
So that's why you can hear the occasional cow and
and the turbo chooks and stuff like that. Yeah. Yep.
And so what's this vineyard called?
So this is Sailor Six Horse Vineyard. We had this idea when we formulated the idea, I guess, would have been at 2007, that we wanted to go somewhere that was right on the edge in terms of viticultural possibility, I guess, in Australia. And either you go high or you go south. And so we're like, right, what's the coolest region in Australia for making wine? And when we did the research, it seemed to be the Huon Valley was the one. And so we're like, right, okay, it's pretty cool down there. And then looked at the anecdotal evidence of elsewhere and Panorama and Home Hill, and looked at those three vineyards and just went, geez, they're punching above their weight and they're sort of doing good things down there, but nobody else seems to be planting down there. It's kind of a bit odd, but but it kind of felt like somewhere that was, it wasn't for the faint-hearted and sort of, would be challenging, but it was always that idea of, with great risk comes great reward. And we came down here with the assumption that, we'd probably make great, in those warmer years, you would be making great wine. And in those cooler years, maybe they wouldn't be that great, but, we were coming down here to make great wines. So it wasn't, it's not about consistency. It's not about, if we wanted that, we'd go somewhere else in Australia and you'd go, okay, well, we're going to, every year we'll get it ripe and we'll harvest it in February and that'll be fine. And, we'll make some nice Pinot. And it was never about that. It was about making something that was a little bit more challenging than that. So that's why we chose down here. So we came across for our honeymoon in 2008 to Tassie, and we had a look all around the different areas. Up north and on the east coast and Coal River and Derwent, and the last place we came was the Huon Valley. We'd already had the idea that it would tick the boxes that we wanted, so we were looking for somewhere, as we said, super really cool and where you just get ripe, So you're sort of having those long, cool summers where, especially with Pinot, you want those kind of those aromatics and the acidity to remain, and sort of, we weren't looking for a sort of gutsy kind of a Pinot. We wanted something with delicacy and restraint and elegance, and something that would evolve in glass. It would be slightly more savoury in terms of flavour profile and more structured.
And so when did you move to the Huon?
That was in 2010. So we'd done vintage at Pinot, so obviously Margaret River, not renowned for Pinot Noir, so we knew we needed to do Pinot Noir vintages. So we did. We went to Oregon in 2007. We went to New Zealand in 2008, so over in Oregon we went for Beaufrere and Chehalem, and in New Zealand we went for Mount Difficulty. And again, they were just really interesting places, and when we were there, we sort of saw that we saw this link between Burgundy, Oregon and California, and then New Zealand. And there was this little triangle. Everybody knew each other. Everybody worked in each other's wineries, and there was a real network there. And Australia kind of sat outside of that. It wasn't part of that group. It never felt like it was really taken that seriously. You'd say, we're going to go make Pinot Noir in Australia. Yeah, radio. Good luck.
How did you fall in love with Pinot Noir?
Being young, you sort of go through that sort of period in the early part of my, wine education. I guess you go through that sort of big Shiraz-y kind of zone. And so, I loved Australian wines. I thought, there's a lot of the things like Darrenberg and stuff coming across the UK back in the early 2000s, late 90s kind of zone where, Australian wine was massive in the UK then. And so there were all these gutsy sort of reds coming through, and it was like, yeah, I love those. And then as your sort of tastes evolve, it just sort of came round as I was hitting sort of like my mid-20s to late 30s. I just found myself drinking a lot of Pinot Noir.
At what point did you realise that people were making some good Pinot Noir in Australia?
Yeah, that's one of the things. It was, I think, so when you change your life, part of what you want to do, or we wanted to do, was make it as challenging as possible. And I think at the time it was, Australian Pinot Noir, it's not great. That's a pretty big, Pinot Noir in itself is a big challenge. People always say, how capricious it is, and how, it's very responsive to site, and not everywhere suited for Pinot Noir in the same way as Nebbiolo. But certainly that was a challenge. And then it was making great Australian Pinot Noir. That's going to be even more of a challenge. So that was and that was definitely in that sort of early, around that time that we were thinking about going into the industry.
What year are we talking?
So that'd be sort of around 2004-5 kind of mark. And in Australia, in the UK, we weren't getting the Bindies and that kind of thing of the world, of Australia. So it was. So we weren't necessarily seeing those few producers who were excelling in Pinot Noir. And I think when we first started we moved to Margaret River, I did a postgrad diploma, Gilli did the degree. And even then, in 2005, 6, 7, Australia didn't really have that kind of, a great reputation for Pinot Noir.
Do you think that Huon Valley Pinot and Australian Pinot in general is now getting the recognition among that sort of global Pinophile demographic?
I think it's starting to change. It's definitely not there yet. But I know, we went to the International Pinot Noir celebration over in Oregon a couple of years ago now, and the theme it's held every year. It's in McMinnville in Oregon, and it's 1,000, 1,500 people, something like that, who are Pinot Noir lovers who all come together and have this great weekend celebration. Most years it focuses on Burgundy or New Zealand or Oregon or California, and a couple of years ago the focus was on Australia. And it was great. Halliday went across, and Michael Hill Smith, and various. You had Mac Forbes and Mike Simons and Michael Dillon from Bindi, and various other people. And it was so it was this quite heavy hitting sort of the greats of Australian Pinot Noir over there. And I guess the idea was to show Pinot Noirs from Australia can compete with the rest of the world. But certainly in America, there is a degree of cynicism. So Home Hill were so we made that wine, and had been selected to show at the grand seminar. And so Gilli and I went in, and we were going to go and talk, so we had to stand up and give our little spiel in front of 1,000 people or whatever it was, and tell them about the Huon Valley and the wine and how it was made and grown. But on the way in, I walked past this couple of guys, and they were walking away from the venue, and I heard them, and this guy said, hey, what's this? What's it about this year? And the other guy said, it's about Australian Pinot Noir. And the other guy went, ugh. And, as you're walking, that was just before we were about to talk to this 1,000 people about, Australian and Huon Valley Pinot Noir. Like, it was like, oh, rightio, okay, this is a big leap. This is quite a challenge. This is what people's general perception of Australian Pinot Noir is. Like, it unfortunately falls into that sort of critter wine kind of context of Australian wine in America. And so, it was an attempt to get over that and show people that we do make great Pinot Noir in Australia. And the great thing about the tasting was that people sat there, and you could see people just going, wow, these wines, so many people look surprised. And that was, that's a start. People being surprised that Australia is actually turning out some pretty exceptional Pinot Noirs, from, the slightly lighter, more ethereal sort of perfume style to slightly more robust sort of, more structural kind of styles. And there was a great range of Pinots there. They showed well. And it was great. It was, seeing people challenged and accepting that challenge and recognizing that actually Australia's starting to do things. And, the feedback we had was, certainly as we were walking around and talking to people, was, wow, that Home Hill wine was exceptional. Like, it was, you guys are doing some great stuff down in Tasmania.
The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at @ByJamesAtkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.